A story of my personal transformation from somebody who had spent all my meaningful adult life up until that point learning how to kill Russians. And in the process, living amongst the enemy, the Soviets, the Russians, and realizing that, after not just living amongst them, working with them, learning about them, seeing them as fellow human beings, realizing that I didn't really want to kill these people anymore, that what I had been doing made no sense. And that led me down the path of believing that nuclear war should be avoided at all costs. The treaty that I implemented was the first treaty to eliminate an entire class of nuclear delivery systems, intermediate range missiles. It helped stabilize the world. I believe it helped save the world. And I became a big believer in arms control and a big believer in, avoiding conflicts, of repairing relations between nations.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. February 24th, 2022, a date the world will remember. Western media framed this day as the start of an unprovoked invasion, but in reality, this is far from a mindless act of aggression. Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is a calculated, strategic maneuver designed not just to defend its borders, but to confront a much larger adversary. NATO, led by the United States, what began as a military intervention to secure Donbas and Crimea has spiraled in an indirect but unmistakable war with the West. As Mr. Scott Ritter has often pointed out, this conflict was never about the direct confrontation between Ukraine and Russia alone. It has always been about the West using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia. Ritter's analysis of the military strategy here sheds light on why Russia's patience and restraint have been so effective. For nearly 3 years, the Russian military has withstood NATO's attempts to push it back, with Ukraine acting as NATO's proxy on the front lines. But beyond the battlefield, Russia's restraint and strategy have left analysts and observers around the world baffled. Today, we're going to delve into the most pressing questions about this operation, starting with the one that the West can't seem to wrap its head around. Why hasn't Russia crushed Ukraine yet? This is the question that dominates every Western narrative, but it's a question that reveals just how little the West understands Russia's strategy. The assumption in the West is that war should be waged with overwhelming force, blitzkrieg-style offensives, carpet bombing, and brute military might. But Russia is not playing by Western rules. This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Iraq. Russia's patience isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strategic brilliance. Let's go back to the first few months of this operation. By March 2022, Russia, with just 150,000 troops, had forced Ukraine's military, an army of nearly 1 million soldiers, into a negotiation at Istanbul. You heard that right. Just 150,000 Russian soldiers faced off against 700,000 regular Ukrainian troops, backed by another 300,000 from Ukraine's National Guard. Despite these overwhelming odds, Russia had Ukraine cornered, but there's more. During those early weeks, Russia's military was striking with precision. Key infrastructure in Ukraine was disabled, its air defenses were crippled, and its forces were on the retreat. Yet by March, Ukraine, under NATO and US direction, abandoned the Istanbul peace talks. And why? Because Washington and London intervened, refusing to let Kiev settle for peace. The West didn't want a negotiated settlement. They wanted war, and Ukraine's leaders had no choice but to comply. Let's be clear, Russia's goal in the early stages was never to conquer all of Ukraine. In fact, Russian forces held back deliberately. They didn't flatten cities like the West expected. Look at Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, when has the US or NATO ever held back? They obliterated civilian infrastructure with little concern for collateral damage. But Russia's approach was far more calculated. By March 2022, it was clear Russia wasn't aiming for total annihilation. They were aiming to force Ukraine into a reasonable settlement, and for a moment they succeeded until NATO tore up the deal. From that point forward, the conflict transformed. It was no longer just Russia against Ukraine, it was Russia against NATO, using Ukraine as a pawn. By 2023, the United States alone had funneled $46.6 billion in military aid to Ukraine. And we're not talking about small arms. This was heavy artillery, HIMARS systems, anti-aircraft defenses, and more. Eastern European NATO members poured in billions in Soviet-era weaponry to bolster Ukraine's crumbling forces. The question is not why Russia hasn't defeated Ukraine. The real question is how NATO, with all its resources, has failed to defeat Russia. The West expected Russia to fall within months, yet, as we speak, Russia continues to stand strong. Russian forces have held their lines, withstood Ukrainian NATO-backed offensives, and demonstrated that patience can often be more effective than brute force. And now we arrive at the next question: why hasn't Russia unleashed its full military might? As Scott Ritter has often emphasized, Russia's restraint in this conflict isn't a sign of weakness, but a tactical decision designed to conserve strength for a long-term engagement against NATO. Ritter's insight is critical in understanding the complexity of Russia's military approach. Why hasn't Russia unleashed its full military potential to crush Ukraine once and for all? It's a question loaded with Western assumptions. The US and NATO view war through the lens of overwhelming force, shock and awe, mass destruction, and immediate results. But Russia's strategy is one of measured restraint. Instead of reducing cities to rubble or launching an all-out offensive that would lead to massive civilian casualties, Russia has chosen a more careful, patient path. Take Kherson and Kharkov as examples. In 2022, Russian forces withdrew from these regions, and immediately the West declared victory. But this was no defeat for Russia. This was a tactical decision, one that allowed Russia to regroup and strategically position itself for the long haul. When Ukraine, armed to the teeth with NATO's latest equipment, HIMARS, Storm Shadow missiles, and Leopard tanks, launched their counteroffensive, the result was catastrophic. The Ukrainian forces, despite having NATO's back,